Whoa! It's me. I'm back. Howdy, I'm Sonja, and I write. And this is episode 2 of I Read My Embarrassing Fan Fiction to the Internet, audiobook style. So since last week's upload of episode 1 of this series, I've decided to make some petite changes to how I'm going to be delivering you all the content, because quite frankly, I would like this ride to be as smooth as possible. First of all, no more sound effects. And I know I promised you guys sound effects for all of the episodes. I said it was going to be this huge cool thing, but after receiving some feedback, I found that when I added the sound effects to episode 1, they were quite distracting to the listener. They're being scrapped. No more sound effects. I'm so sorry. Change number 2. These are juicy chapters. They're thick. They got a little bit of size to them. And with size comes time in this context, because the first episode of the series was over 30 minutes long, and I've come to the conclusion that some of you might be getting bored in those 30 minutes. So from now on, the episodes will not be 30 minutes long. Instead of delivering one massive video of a full chapter, my episodes are now going to be splitting up chapters into smaller sections so that you can get through them much easier. Number 3, and finally, I'd like to say a massive thank you to everyone who supports me on Wattpad, because we just hit 8.5 thousand reads. That is more than 5 reads, guys. That is a friggin' lot. We were at only 7,000 reads last week. So thank you so much to everybody who supports me on Wattpad, and for those readers who have come to support me here, thank you so much. I already see you guys leaving your comments. That's so sweet of you all. Thank you. If you're new here, hi. This is episode 2 of my fanfiction audiobook, and today we dive into chapter 2, Pink Martini Traitors.
Hungry. Wyan was very hungry. Her stomach twisted in angry knots as she drove down the streets of Naples, bathing in the mild summer heat. Though her focus should have been directed to getting back to the city prison for the second time that day, her stomach had other plans, encouraging her eyes to scan the array of buildings for some kind of fast food joint. A single slice of buttered bread had not been a suitable choice of breakfast at 3 a.m., and skipping out on her lunch left a rather unpleasant feeling in Wyan's midsection, though, with how her day had been going so far, she had no time for food. Working in the mafia took a bite out of her regular eating habits. The 3 weeks that Wyan had worked for Leaky Eye Luca were nothing compared to the hustle and bustle she had experienced with delivering Polpo's message to the Bodyguard Squad. Wyan had previously been tasked with meeting strange men in alleyways and dark street corners where she would ramble off a list of names or numbers, and then be on her way. No eye contact, no questions asked. She was an outsider, after all, so she avoided any business that wasn't her own. And to their credit, the low-end members of the notorious gang, Passione, were as cautious as Wyan was. There was never a need to question or be questioned. But when one of Passione's incarcerated capos asked Wyan to take part in real mafia business for the first and final time, she had not expected an immediate interrogation at a restaurant full of young, oddly dressed men. In all honesty, Wyan wasn't sure what to expect when she arrived at Lebecchio's, the restaurant where Bucciarati and his team regularly ate. A group of older men smelling thickly of overused cologne and preoccupied with an array of strippers was more anticipated. But instead, upon her arrival, Wyan was met with a group of teenage boys shoveling cake into their mouths, led by another, more charming teenage boy. And what surprised her the most was the interest she took in the message she had to deliver. Never had Wyan been so curious about a report. The regular messages she delivered were a series of random names and strange numbers, leaving no room for imagination or any sort of creative flair. But this message had been scripted poetically, leaving Wyan wondering what it meant. And clearly, what she had relayed to Bucciarati and his team was urgent. The second that he heard Polpo's message, Bucciarati immediately gathered his men and went out to deal with the problem. No wonder the Bodyguard Squad was so highly respected by the capo. Those men meant business. Through brightly lit streets and maneuvering her car around hordes of pedestrians, Wyan decided that she would go to Polpo before getting herself something to eat. She would tell him that his message was delivered successfully, and then could she treat herself to a dinner out in the city. Her mouth began to water at the thought of eating an extra-large helping of linguine allo scoglio at one of the many infamous seaside restaurants that Naples had to offer. But before she could do any more daydreaming about food and fancy beverages, Wyan had to go to the city prison. Parking in front of the same vacant building she had just hours before brought on a rather odd thought. Luca, who had treated her shamelessly those past 3 weeks and even just that morning, had gone out of his way to call Bucciarati and inform him of her loyalty to Passione. Luca's change in behavior had been evident in the prison when confronted by Polpo, but had his mood toward Wyan continued to improve? Was she going to finally be given the respect she deserved? Wyan sent searching fingers into the glove compartment, attempting to locate her phone. The cool touch of metal grazed her palm, and with practiced movements, the flip phone had been sprung open and Luca's number dialed. The receiver buzzed twice before Wyan was met with her boss's familiar voice. "Speak," is all he said. "I was just calling to say thank you for thinking ahead and calling Mr. Bucciarati." "I think what you want to say is, thank you for correcting my stupidity. It was a fool's mistake to head into the mouth of a beast without any form of protection. And that is exactly what Wyan did when she headed into Labecchio's without any solid proof of her loyalty to Passione. For all Bucciarati knew, Wyan was some sort of undercover cop, handing out lies. I apologize." Wyan took a breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. As she stood out of the car, Luca's voice filled her ear like cold running water. "Of course you apologize. That's all you ever do. Listen here, the only reason I called Bucciarati was to cover for myself. I'm not your saving grace. I think we both know that if you would have failed to deliver the message, both you and I would be missing our heads thanks to that crazed capo Polpo." It wasn't until she rounded a street corner and faced a line of beautiful buildings that Luca began to speak again. His voice remained solid, but his words were somehow softer. "Listen, Wyan, drop my number, 'kay? Remember what Polpo said this morning? You're no longer under my watch. Bye, until I see you next." In a buzz, the phone call had ended, and with several swipes of her nimble fingers, Luca's number had been blocked and deleted. The officers that lounged at the building's entrance didn't question why Wyan had returned to the prison for a second time that day. Instead, they remained too fixated on their own gossip to care that she was walking through the sliding doors once again. Her shoes clicked as she moved toward a short female officer who quickly waved at Wyan, directing her to step through the metal detector once again. The handheld machine was lazily swung up and down the sides of her body before she was let through the security gate. "Polpo says it's urgent, so you should get a move on." It took Wyan a moment to realize that the female officer had been talking to her. Turning back to face the woman, Wyan nodded in thanks and hustled down the building's long hallway. She followed the damp stone walls all the way to the fogged glass of the capo's prison cell. The transparent barrier dripped with condensation, and the air remained thick with sweat and body odor. Without an AC unit in sight, Wyan had to wonder how the prisoners around here survived. Polpo was sitting up with loose paper in his thick hands and a slice of pizza dangling from his mouth. He didn't notice her approach, so Wyan cautiously knocked twice on the cell's broad window, grabbing his attention immediately. She expected Polpo to grin or flare his brows at her, the same look that a cat would shoot towards meek little mice. But instead, she was met with an eagerness that the capo could not hide. He wasted no time with games and got straight to the point. "Take this," he said, slipping a document through the food slot after finishing the last bite of his pizza slice. "Memorize it and deliver the message to the Bodyguard Squad right away." Polpo went back to scanning the pages in his hands as Wyan took the slip of paper and read it to herself. "The pink Martini Traitors, with their vicious fangs, will use their venom on the golden zipper," is what was scribbled on the sheet. And even further down from the scratchy handwriting was an address. Suddenly, clouded with questions, Wyan looked up at the capo in hopes that he could read the look on her face and answer at least one. Would this address lead her to the Bodyguard Squad? What is the pink martini? Fangs, venom, and golden zippers? Was delivering another message not going against Polpo's own word? Her brows furrowed deeply as she peered up at the man. One short glance to his left, and Polpo let out a thick sigh. "The address will lead you to Bucciarati. You need to go now. This is a very urgent matter." One question had been answered. Polpo shuffled in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position while Wyan scanned the page several times over to memorize the message. Finally, she placed the paper back into the empty slot and tilted her head to meet the capo's gaze. Sweat covered his round face and dripped from the tip of his slender nose. His black eyes were wide, and a look of concern crossed his features as Wyan peered up at him. "You need to get this message to the Bodyguard Squad, or death will meet my most trusted men." Wyan took off in a sprint down the prison's slender hall. Pushing her legs, she ran faster and faster. While she had no sympathy for the gangsters of the Bodyguard Squad, the idea of Polpo getting angry at her made Wyan run as fast as she could. "Well, that was a quick visit," the short officer said. "It was all Wyan could manage, still catching her breath. "I knew a little thing like you couldn't stand to be in the same area as that beast," the cop laughed to herself. But Wyan remained quiet. Did the officer think she was running away out of fear? Better that than the cop finding out she was working for the monster behind bars. The woman flicked the metal detector up and down Wyan's body before allowing her to leave. As casually as she could, the messenger jogged past the sliding doors and back into the city street. Though the message in its entirety was eye-catching, two words stood out rather vibrantly to Wyan: vipers and venom, words so easily associated with evil. The moment she first read the message, Wyan knew something was wrong within the walls of Passione. Turning a final street corner, Wyan let out an exasperated sigh as she practically dove into the front seat of her car. The location where Polpo had directed her was familiar, a street of elegant buildings that backed onto a beach, known for bringing in high-class patrons. Wyan didn't find herself going down Via Romana very often, but she regularly walked by the classy avenue on her daily deliveries for Leaky Eye Luca. Wyan drove quickly, or as quickly as the crowded streets would allow her to. It had been 2 hours since her visit with the Bodyguard Squad, and the streets of Napoli were bustling with people looking for a place to eat. Lunchtime was always leaving the city packed with civilians wandering about, but this particular day left Napoli swarming with tourists. All Wyan could do was try her best to politely honk her horn at the pedestrians. In all honesty, simply driving over the civilians had crossed her mind at least twice in the hour that it took her to get to the location Polpo had disclosed, and she was impressed that she managed to make it without having to run anyone down. A salty ocean tang filled her car as Wyan turned down Via Romana. Elder trees had parted to make room for the cobblestone roadway that stretched hundreds of meters ahead of her, and tall, trimmed bushes guarded each of the buildings that sat neatly on the street. From her car window, she couldn't make out any of the estates hidden behind the green shrubbery, but long, stony driveways had split the bushes in two, allowing for guests to enter and leave as they pleased. Her gray model of the 1999 Fiat felt rather out of place as she drove past the luxurious cars and received stares from subjective strangers. But too consumed by the stress to notice any of their wandering glares, Wyan drove onward in search of her final destination, building number 503. At the furthest end of Via Romana sat a rectangular building enclosed not only by shrubbery but also guarded by a large ornate gate. Her eyes had been drawn to a stone slab that sat at the foot of the venue's driveway, reading 503 Via Romana. She had arrived, and lucky enough for her, the gates were wide open. The long driveway was lined with small trees, pointing Wyan in the direction of her destination. Red stone walls shone brightly against the deep blue of the horizon. The sea moved stoically from behind, and seabirds clouded the bright sky from above. A fountain sat methodically in front of the venue's entrance, and two men dressed in all black stood at the foot of the building's long veranda. Pulling her car to a stop close to the building's front, Wyan stepped out and marched toward the main doors. "I can park your car, miss," a silky voice said from Wyan's left. Noticing the valet driver dressed in a dark suit, eagerly awaiting her approval, Wyan tossed the man her keys and nodded in thanks. Wow, she thought. Getting into a bougie place like this was a lot easier than I expected. "Welcome to the Pink Martini." Her thoughts were cut short when the man with her keys called out from behind her. Stopping in her tracks, Wyan swung her head to face the valet in shock. The Pink Martini in Polpo's message was not a drink or a person, but it was a place. How could she not have realized this? Tearing her stare away from the man, Wyan moved forwards, and upon entering the building, her ears were met with the soft chatter of patrons and a breezy tune of jazz. She was in a lounge, a jazz bar with drinks, elegantly dressed women, and high-class men. The soft, warm light of the Pink Martini was inviting, and the smell of pizza, bruschetta, and ricotta with roasted tomatoes practically pulled Wyan into the lounge. But after taking a single step into the Pink Martini, a pair of hefty men in dark suits stood in her path. "Excuse me, miss, but we're going to have to ask you your name and who invited you before we can let you in," the darker man with the black bow tie had said. "Okay, so I guess it's not all that easy to get in," she mused to herself. Wyan broke out in a nervous sweat. She didn't have time to chat with security, and she didn't know if telling them that she was delivering a message for a mafioso would be all that good of an idea. Instead, she ignored their presence and searched the bar. She stood on the tips of her toes to try and see over the security guards, attempting to locate anyone of familiarity, anyone that could get her closer to delivering the message to Bucciarati and his team. A flash of purple and white caught her wandering eye. It was him, the biggest of the Bodyguard Squad, lounging at a table with a tall glass full of deep red liquid. He wasn't hard to miss. His long lilac hair stood out in the dark crowd. He sat lazily, with his legs spread and his broad back pressed against the end of the chair. Wyan raised her hand, swinging it in the air, trying to catch the man's attention. But with most of his back pointed toward her, he was unable to see her feeble attempts at recognition.
I'm so proud of you for sticking it out all the way to the end. Thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode of Guilty Conscience, the Pink Martini Traitors. I hope you enjoyed. Please feel free to like, comment, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you around.